Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm really glad you're here. If you're new here, my name is Becca, and this channel is all about my love for spinning, knitting, weaving, sewing, all the fiber things. If you're enjoying this fiber adventure, please consider leaving a like and a comment, or subscribing to my channel, or sharing with your friends. I invite you to grab whatever project you have on the go and join me. Let's make some stuff. One of the best things about making your own clothing is that you can make it to fit exactly you. And if you go to a shop and look for clothing there, if they don't have your size or it doesn't fit the way you want, you're sort of out of luck. But by doing it at home, you can change whatever you want to make it your own. And that's just beautiful. And I want to give a special shout out to my local yarn shop, Yarn Social KC, for being such amazing advocates for size inclusivity in the knitting community. Unfortunately, many patterns, both for sewing and for knitting, are not as inclusive as they could be and don't consider every size of every body and every shape of every body. And so this is especially true with all over Colorwork stranded knitting sweaters, where they're often made in one size or one size fits most. And like I assume several of you who are watching and clicked on this video, this also applies to you, that, you know, I found many times that I do not fit into the fits most category, and I know this can be really disheartening when you discover that your size is not in a pattern that you fell in love with. And today I want to share with you how I went about adjusting a couple of all over patterns to fit my size that wasn't included. So the sweater that I'm wearing is the Lindisfarne pattern from Alice Starmore's book, The Celtic Collection, which I have here. So this pattern is from The Celtic Collection by Alice Starmore. This is the cover of the book, and when I saw this design, I just was blown away. Also, the photographs in the Alice Starmore books are just beautiful, and if you can pick them up, I highly encourage you to. Alice Starmore's patterns are just amazing. Here is a photo of the sweater, so I think it looks pretty close. This pattern has 14 different colors in it, and I tried to match the colors to what was used in the pattern pretty closely. Alice Starmore sells kits for the patterns, and that includes the pattern and the yarn. But I already had yarn in my stash, as you see behind me, that I wanted to use for this pattern. This is in Knit Picks palette, so this is 100% wool from Knit Picks in a variety of colors, as you see. This was, again, 14 colors in this this pattern, but it is Fair Isle, so each row is just 2 colors, and you just carry the yarn up the side. So I saw this pattern, I fell in love with it. I knew I had to make this sweater. And then I looked at the pattern, and it says the sizes. One size fits chest or bust 86 to 97 centimeters or 34 to 38 inches. Well, that wasn't me. At the time that I made this sweater, I've lost some weight, so it's a little bit looser than it was. But when I made this sweater, my bust was 50 inches, so not even going to come close. Even considering there's some looseness to the sweater, the finished size in this pattern is 44 inches around the circumference of the hips, and that just wasn't going to happen. So I knew if I wanted to make this pattern, I had to make some pretty drastic adjustments. And I wanted to make this sweater. The second sweater that I want to share with you is from another pattern book. This next one is from a book called Medieval Inspired Sweaters. This book is by Anna Karen Lundberg, and this book is so cool. It is inspired by the colors and patterns inside, painted on the walls, inside Swedish medieval churches. And the designs are just amazing. These are primarily sweaters. But in this case, I wanted to make a sweater for my husband. The sweater I made, I wanted to combine the shape of this pattern, which is the Norsunda wreath pullover, but instead of that color chart, I wanted to use the chart from this pattern, which is the Songa brocade flower jacket. And because I wanted to combine these two patterns, that meant adjusting this all over chart to fit a different size of or shape of sweater. And so I had to make similar adjustments to this sweater as I did to the Lindisfarne sweater, so that I could adjust that all over pattern to fit a different shape. And here's the finished sweater. This one has two shades of blue and then this contrasting red-brown accent at the neck and the sleeves and the hem. I made the sweater for my husband, but I also wear it even though the shoulders are too wide and the sleeves are too long, just because it turned out so beautifully. Again, this is in Knit Picks palette in two shades of blue and the red-brown. So now I'm going to show you how I did this. There are many ways to adjust patterns for size, and not all of them may work in every situation. Some of them are easier than others. But this specifically is for one of the, I think, the most complicated how to adjust the pattern, because you have to not only deal with the size of the garment, but the shape, the placement of the color chart, so that it won't be exactly like the pattern, but it will give you the impression of the original pattern, and I think still be the same. Ultimately, I advocate for size inclusivity in pattern writing, so if you're a pattern designer, please consider adding adjustments for many sizes, both on the small end and on the large end of your design, or instructions for how to modify it if that's needed. Another thing that's really important is adding a schematic in your design, showing the finished measurements of each element of the pattern, so bust, waist, hips, sleeve length, shoulder to shoulder, and length, so that knitters like me and like some of you can use this information to make adjustments as we need to. So let's get on into the technicalities of how to do this. So if you take your measurements and your sizes and in the patterns, there are several things that you can do to adjust it. And I'll put all these instructions in the description box so you can look at them and maybe they'll be helpful to you. But at its most basic, size of the finished object really comes down to how big the stitches are and how many of them you make. So this means gauge and swatching. And I know the urge to cast on is strong, but planning really makes all the difference here. And if you don't do it, the risk is that you may end up with a garment that you don't like, doesn't fit, looks weird. Planning is important, so gauge and swatching. The first step is to start with the size of needles that's called for in the pattern and the yarn that you want to use. For an all-over pattern, as in the case of the two sweaters that I've shown you, you'll want to knit a few repeats of the main chart repeat. Do it in the round. These were done in the round. And steek, that means cutting your knitting. But knit them in the round, steek, and then block and dry before you measure the number of stitches in your gauge. Measure about 4 inches and make sure that you count both the number of stitches and the number of rows, because this is going to be important for getting the length that you want. So now the question is, are you getting the same gauge as in the pattern instructions? If you're not, you can go up or down a needle size and swatch again, and make sure that you like how the finished gauge swatch drapes and feels, that you like the fabric that you've made. And when you have a needle and yarn combination that creates the fabric that you like, you can start modifying the pattern. Now, if your size is only slightly larger or smaller than the pattern, sometimes you can just adjust the needle size, and that will change the pattern. If it's quite different though, as in my case, my bust was way different than the finished garment size, let alone the size of the personal measurements in the pattern, so I had to make some big adjustments. A good pattern should have both personal measurements, bust, length, waist, etc., but also finished measurements of the finished garment. Take a look at both of those and subtract the personal measurements from the finished garment measurements to calculate how much ease the garment has. Sweaters will often have a few inches or centimeters of positive ease, which means that the sweater will be loose once it's finished. Some close-fitting sweaters actually have negative ease, which means that the sweater is going to stretch to fit over your curves. And knowing how the actual fabric will behave is very important for knowing how much stretch you'll have in the finished garment. Good thing you did that swatch. Especially in the case of colors, where you're carrying the non-dominant color, the color in the background, that's going to limit the stretch. That you have in the final garment. Now take your measurements. Be honest with yourself, this is not the time for wishful thinking. You want this to fit, right? So you may need to find a friend to help you with this, but you can do it by yourself. I've taken my own measurements many times. But if you're not sure that you got it right, try it a few times and see if you come up with the same numbers. Measure around the largest part of your chest. Take a deep breath in and let the tape expand slightly with your body. This is your bust or chest measurement. Then do the same thing with your waist. And your hips. Measure the length from the back of your neck to where you want the sweater hem. Then measure the width of your shoulders and the length of your arm from the shoulder joint to the wrist. Write all of these down. Congratulations, you now have a personalized measurement chart. Okay, back to the pattern. Remember those ease measurements. If you like how the pattern fits on the model, add those ease measurements to your personal measurements. If you want your sweater to be looser or more fitted, you can adjust that here by adding or subtracting ease. I like to draw out a little picture or schematic of the sweater with the new measurements, similar to this. Sometimes patterns have these and some of them don't. I find it really helpful to keep track of my adjustments. the size of the chest bust subtracted from the size of the overall knitted measurements. And in this case, they're saying 44 inches is the finished garment for a bust from 34 to 38 inches. So we're looking at 10 inches or so of positive ease in this pattern. So for this pattern, if we're going on the ease here, the bust, waist, and hip, these are all a straight line. In this pattern, it's just a column sweater. So let's say 47 inches, and we want 10 inches of ease. So this is going to be 57 inches for the circumference, which is going to be the same around the bust. Our length overall from the back is 25.5 inches. Our sleeve length is 21.5 inches to the from the shoulder seam to the cuff. And now some math. Deep breath. Remember, the important thing is the number of stitches and how big each one of them is. We need to figure out how many stitches we need to cast on to get the circumference to match our finished size. I start by checking with the pattern. Gauge in the pattern is 12 stitches by 14 rows equals 2 inches over the chart pattern using US 5 needles and working on the right side only, which means you're going to do that swatch in the round. So to figure out how to translate the tension that they expect to the pattern, we're going to take divide the number of stitches, 12 stitches, by the number of inches in their gauge to get the number of stitches per inch. So 12 stitches divided by 2 inches equals 6 stitches per inch. This might not be in whole stitches, and that's okay. So now multiply the number of stitches per inch, this number here, by the finished measurements for the cast on edge. So by the 44 inches times 44 inches equals, you can use a calculator here, no shame in that. So we're going to multiply the number of stitches per inch times the number of inches. 264 stitches is how many they should expect in the circumference to get that gauge. So if the pattern is knit from the bottom up, as this one is, cast on 264 stitches, exactly like that. So if that matches, that's great. If not, that might mean that there's a ribbed hem or something else that is a little bit different. So look through the pattern and find where the gauge swatch pattern is. That might be the waist, that might be right above the hem, and see if the stitch measurement by gauge matches there. Once you know how the pattern gauge matches to the pattern, you can translate your measurements into the pattern. So in my case, my gauge was 15 stitches and 20 rows equals 2 inches. So my stitches per inch, again, we're going to divide the number of stitches by the number of inches, is 7.5 stitches per inch. And I want my circumference to be 57 inches. So back to my calculator. 7.5 stitches per inch times 57 inches equals 427.5 stitches. So just to go over that again, you're going to divide your gauge by the number of inches in your gauge. So 15 divided by 2 is 7.5. That's how many stitches per inch, and then you multiply that by the number of inches in your circumference to get the number of stitches at the cast on. So this is the number of stitches in the circumference based on your measurements alone. You can go through the pattern and look for any increase or decrease sections and adjust those to match your measurements and gauge using the number of stitches per inch as your guide. You can also use your row gauge. Remember, I said that was going to be important. 14 rows in the pattern, 20 rows for mine. So there's a big difference in my row gauge. And you can use that to adjust the number of rows in each section. So now if you're knitting a plain stockinette sweater, you're done. But we still have that color chart to deal with. Color charts are written as repeating patterns, and we can figure out how big each pattern repeat will be based on our stitches per inch and our rows per inch from the gauge swatch. We can also look for how many pattern repeats are used in the instructions. So to make our sweater bigger, we'll add more pattern repeats. For my Lindisfarne sweater, I did 6 repeats of the pattern chart instead of 4. Take the number of stitches you need for the circumference based on your measurements and divide that by the number of stitches in the pattern repeat. For the Lindisfarne pattern, it is 66 pattern stitches. So we're going to take the number of stitches based on our measurements, 427.5. Don't worry that it's not a whole number of stitches just yet. Divide that by the number of stitches in the chart, and you get the number of pattern repeats that make up that circumference. So I have 6.477. I could either figure out what 0.477 of the pattern is, or I can adjust here so that by rounding up or rounding down the number of pattern repeats, I end up with an even number of patterns. And this is a decision you have to make, so it depends on whether you want a little more or a little less ease. So I decided to round down. So instead of 6.47 pattern repeats, I went down to 6 pattern repeats. So now we have to figure out how many stitches to cast on. And you do that by multiplying the number of pattern repeats you've decided, 6 here, multiplied by the number of stitches in the chart, which we had 66, plus any extra stitches. Sometimes the pattern repeat will say 12 plus 2 stitches or something like that. You add those on at the end. So 6 times 66 pattern repeats times 66 stitches equals 396 stitches. And we can now figure out what that's going to be in terms of our actual circumference by dividing that by our number of stitches per inch. So 396 stitches divided by 7.5 stitches per inch is 52.8 stitches. And that is still positive ease from all of my measurements. So that's what I decided to do in this case. One final thing to consider is the chart placement. So if the number of pattern repeats in the chart is an even number, in this case it was 4, and my number of pattern repeats is also an even number, was 6, the placement of the chart repeats will end up looking similar. So having that 1 star in the center of the garment, and that's how mine ended up. The same is true for odd numbers. So if you have an odd number of pattern repeats and the chart calls for an odd number of pattern repeats, it'll end up looking similar. But if the pattern calls for an even number and you have an odd number, or vice versa, your finished garment will end up being different if you start in the same place. And you can adjust this by starting your knitting in the middle of the chart repeat. So you'll have half a repeat along the side seams, and the center front and the center back will match the pattern. All right, congratulations, you're nearly there. If your row gauge is also different from the pattern instructions, as was the case for me, Decide if you want the finished garment to be longer or shorter than the pattern. Remember that this is a lot of rows, so even a single stitch difference in the stitches per inch or the rows per inch will add up over the length of your garment and make a big difference. So be really thoughtful here. For me, the sleeve length is more important than the body length. I like my sleeves to be the right length. So I end up taking more time making the chart placement harmonious for the sleeve length than I do for the body length. But I do like a long tunic, and this is a long tunic, so that worked out for me as well. As you're knitting, keep checking on your gauge and the piece measurements as you go and adjust as needed. I know it can be tricky, especially with patterns like this where the sleeves and the neck are steeked and you can't try it on as you go. But just trust the process and all of your careful checking and planning. You can do this. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for spending some of your creative time with me. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!